It was one of those slow, golden mornings in Asheville where spring sunlight filtered through cotton curtains like a whispered memory, touching everything with a softness that made even the dust motes dance in reverence. The kind of morning where time seemed to slow down and each sound, each scent, carried the quiet gravity of a story waiting to be told. Inside a modest second-floor apartment on Chestnut Street, tucked between old oak trees and the faded echoes of a once bustling neighborhood, Margaret Collins, 73 years old, sat by her kitchen window, cradling a chipped porcelain cup in both hands, watching the world as if it might finally offer her the one answer that had evaded her for more than half a century. The apartment, much like its occupant, bore the weight of memory with dignity. Framed photographs from a bygone era lined the walls in uneven rows. Hand-stitched linens softened the edges of a well-worn sofa, and a clock on the mantel ticked with the patient insistence of someone who has long given up asking when, and simply measures the silence in between. And there, above the fireplace, hung a black-and-white portrait of Walter Collins, her husband, frozen forever in his U.S. Army uniform, his eyes full of youth, his jaw set with the kind of conviction that war demands from men too young to understand its cost. Walter had left in 1944, full of promises and determination, bound for the European front as part of the famed 2nd Armored Division, and by the spring of 1945, he was listed as missing in action, a phrase that sounded clinical in the mouth of a telegram boy, but which tore through Margaret's world like a cannon blast, leaving no grave to visit, no closure to hold, just a folded flag in a box, and a void that neither time nor prayer had ever managed to fill. She had lived 54 years in that space between presence and absence, in a house that had waited with her, in silence and routine, in unspoken grief disguised as strength, until that day, a knock came at her door. It was part of a new city volunteer program, retired veterans delivering groceries to elderly residents, a kind gesture from a younger generation who didn't know how much was still left unsaid. She had not signed up herself. A neighbor had, thinking it might be good for her. Margaret had expected a college student or a friendly local, not the tall, broad-shouldered man who stood on her porch that morning, wearing an old army cap, holding 2 paper bags in weathered hands, his face carved by time and duty, and his eyes carrying the weight of something heavier than groceries. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice low and steady, like someone reciting a vow he'd practiced for years. "You don't know me, but I made your husband a promise." The words struck her with the force of a forgotten storm, and in that single moment, the decades collapsed around her like paper. Her breath caught, her knees weakened, and her hand gripped the edge of the doorway as though letting go might unravel her completely. Her husband's name, spoken not with pity or distance, but with memory, real memory, hung in the air like sacred truth. And what he said next would change everything she thought she had already buried. If this story is already stirring something in you, the way it stirred something in me, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing the stories that remind us why we still believe in love, in memory, and in the promises time can't erase. And now, stay with me. Because what comes next will break you and heal you in ways you never expected. The man introduced himself as Franklin Hayes, a retired Army sergeant who, during the final months of World War II, had served in the same division as Walter Collins, the 2nd Armored, known to the men who wore its patch as Hell on Wheels. His voice carried the rough edges of someone who had long ago learned how to speak plainly about things others could barely imagine. But in that living room, surrounded by floral wallpaper, antique lamps, and the scent of lemon polish, his words came with an unexpected gentleness, like a soldier entering a sacred place. Margaret, still trying to steady her breath, motioned for him to sit. She hadn't invited a man into her home in years, but this wasn't a social call. This was something older, something deeper, She could feel it in her bones. This man had carried something with him for decades, and it had finally reached its destination. Franklin sat on the edge of the floral armchair near the window, took off his cap, and held it respectfully in his hands. His eyes moved around the room for a moment, until they landed on the photograph above the mantel. The same face he had last seen on a battlefield in Europe, decades ago, covered in dust and blood, but still alive in his memory. "I've looked at that face every night for 54 years, he said quietly, "but never like this." Margaret remained silent, her hand resting on the arm of the chair, her fingers slightly curled, as if holding on to something invisible but vital. Her heart was beating in a rhythm she hadn't felt since the war ended. "We were stationed in the Ardennes," Franklin began, his voice now steadier, pulling memories up from a place so deep they might as well have been buried in the soil of another world. Winter had broken. The snows were melting. It was April. Everyone knew the war was about to end, but the dying hadn't stopped. He paused for a moment, eyes unfocused, staring somewhere beyond the living room wall. "We were hit hard. Ambushed near a small village. I don't even remember the name anymore. Everything was chaos. Smoke, shouting, explosions. And then I saw Walter. He was down. I crawled over to him. He was still conscious, barely, bleeding badly." Margaret pressed her lips together, but her jaw trembled. Franklin leaned forward, cap still clenched in his calloused hands. "He looked at me," he said, "and he wasn't scared, not even angry, just calm, like he knew." He reached into his coat, his left inner pocket, and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He pressed it into my hand and said, "If you make it out, you give this to Margaret. Tell her I didn't stop thinking about her, not for a single damn day." "Dut." His voice cracked slightly on that last word, but he cleared his throat and pressed on. "I told him I would, swore it, right there in the mud." Margaret's breath caught. Her chest rose sharply, and her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Not yet. "I wanted to believe he'd make it," Franklin said, "but he was gone before the medics even arrived. I kept that letter in my jacket all the way through the end of the war, even carried it home with me. But when I got back, everything was different. People didn't want to hear stories about the ones who didn't come back. They wanted to forget the war. And me, I didn't know where to start, didn't know where you were. I looked, but there was no Google back then. Just phone books and faded addresses. I tried for years." He looked down, ashamed. "Then I stopped. Life moved on. I got married, raised 2 boys, lost my wife 5 years ago. And when I moved out here to be closer to my son, they asked me to volunteer. I saw your name on the delivery list last week, and I damn near dropped the paper." Margaret finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but full of a power that had been building inside her since the moment the door opened. "You kept it. All this time." He nodded. "I couldn't let it go. Even when I thought I'd never find you, I couldn't throw it away." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, the same place Walter had kept it, and pulled out a small envelope. It was worn, stained at the corners, the ink faded but legible. "For Margaret, if I don't come home." She didn't take it immediately. She stared at it like it was glowing, like it might vanish if she touched it too quickly. Then, with hands that trembled like leaves in wind, she reached out and took it. The paper was warm from his body, and yet it felt cold, like a voice from the grave, waiting to speak one last time. She didn't open it, not yet. She just held it to her chest, closed her eyes and whispered, "I knew he wouldn't forget me." And for the first time in 54 years, her hands stopped shaking. That night after Franklin had left, promising to return the following day, if only to check in, Margaret remained seated in the same chair by the window, the envelope still clutched gently in her lap, as though it were not simply a piece of aged paper, but a living, breathing part of her past, something that had waited patiently through the wars of the world and the quiet wars of the soul, to be seen again. The sky outside faded slowly into twilight, and the soft hum of distant cars became the background to a silence that was no longer oppressive, but sacred, filled with the presence of a man she had never stopped loving, even though the world had long ago told her to move on. And as darkness settled around her, memory stirred, not with sharp edges, but with the warmth and softness of a film reel flickering to life behind her eyes, pulling her back to a time when hope was young and every goodbye still carried the promise of return. She was 18 when she met Walter Collins, a junior at Asheville High, already helping out part-time at the hardware store his father owned, tall and soft-spoken, with a grin that never tried too hard, and a way of looking at her that made her feel like she was the only person in the room, even when the diner was full and the jukebox was too loud and the war was already waiting at the edge of their lives. It had started with a book she was carrying of Mice and Men under her arm, and he'd asked if she liked Steinbeck, which she did, though mostly because she liked the way he said it, like he cared, like it wasn't a line, like he'd really read it. They spent that summer together, under sycamore trees and starlit skies, in the flickering glow of drive-in movies and the sacred silence of shared milkshakes and side glances that said more than words ever could. He called her Maggie, a name only he ever used, and when he laughed, which wasn't often, it came from somewhere honest, like he was surprised every time joy found him. She remembered how he used to trace circles on the back of her hand with his thumb when they sat together on the hood of his dad's pickup, watching thunderstorms roll in over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Then came the draft. He didn't wait for it. He volunteered, said it didn't feel right to sit still while others fought. She still remembered the way he stood on her porch the night before he left, hands in his coat pockets, the look in his eyes, a mixture of pride and fear he refused to name. He kissed her forehead, pressed something into her palm. A tiny ring he'd fashioned from copper wire, smooth and imperfect, warm from his hand. "I'll trade it for gold when I come back," he said, and she'd believed him because she had to. She wrote to him every week. Her letters were full of home, news from the town, poems she'd copied from magazines, recipes she knew he liked, and always, always the words, "Come back to me." His letters, though fewer, came just the same, careful, deliberate, always ending with "yours always." And then in early 1945 they stopped. No warning, no explanation, just silence. Long, heavy, unrelenting silence. She'd waited months before going to the post office every day felt foolish, waited longer before opening the box in her closet where she kept his letters, felt like reopening a wound she couldn't close. She never got rid of anything, not the copper ring, not the faded envelopes, not the dress she wore the last night she saw him. They became part of the apartment, not as relics, but as companions. Silent witnesses to a life paused mid-sentence. She never married. There were offers, kind men, honest men, even one who looked a little like Walter if the light hit just right. But she couldn't say yes to a future when her past had never said goodbye. So she worked. Taught at the local elementary school, baked for the church fundraisers, volunteered at the library. She built a quiet, good life around the absence of one man. Now, sitting in the stillness of her living room, that life folded in on itself, not collapsing but coming full circle, with the letter in her lap and Franklin's voice still echoing in her mind. Margaret saw it all. The boy with the copper ring, the girl who believed, the war that didn't end when the guns went quiet, and for the first time in over 5 decades, she didn't feel like she was waiting. She was remembering, fully, painfully, beautifully. And in the remembering, something deep inside her finally began to rest. The next morning came wrapped in the kind of quiet only those who've known long grief can recognize. Not emptiness, but a pause in the soul, a kind of sacred hush before something deeply important unfolds. The sunlight poured gently across Margaret's hardwood floors, warming the same spots it had touched for decades, and yet today it seemed to reach just a little farther, as if even the light understood that something long delayed was finally ready to arrive. She had placed the envelope on the small oak table by the window, beside a vase of dogwood blossoms she had picked earlier that week, as if to offer the letter the beauty and dignity it deserved. It sat there, aged, weathered, fragile, and yet somehow stronger than any paper had a right to be. She hadn't opened it the night before. She hadn't needed to. It had been enough just to know it had survived, that he had written it, that he had died thinking of her. When the knock came around 10, soft but certain, she already knew it would be Franklin. She opened the door without hesitation, and there he stood again, the same posture, the same weary kindness in his eyes, though now his expression held something different too, a quiet reverence, a man who had delivered the weight he'd carried and now stood witness to its unfolding. "I hope I didn't come too early," he said. "No," she replied, her voice steady but soft. "You came exactly when you were supposed to." She invited him in without formality. They returned to the same seats as the day before, and the silence that filled the space between them felt almost like music, the kind of silence that understands pain, that honors it, that doesn't try to fix or fill it, but simply allows it to be. "I haven't opened it yet," Margaret said, nodding toward the envelope. "I thought maybe I didn't want to be alone when I did." Franklin said nothing but nodded, and that nod said everything. She reached for the envelope, cradling it as though it were glass, and slowly, carefully unsealed the flap. The paper inside was thin, folded twice, yellowed at the edges, but his handwriting, familiar, beloved, stood strong against the years, each curve and line whispering his voice into the room. She took a breath. And then she read, aloud for both of them to hear. "My dearest Maggie, if this letter ever reaches you, then I didn't make it. And I hate that. God, I hate that. Because there was so much I wanted to do with you. Grow old, build a house, watch our kids chase fireflies in the summer. I thought about those things every day. They were what kept me sane. You were what kept me sane. I carried your letters in my breast pocket, every one of them. I read them in foxholes and train cars and quiet moments between the hell. I memorized them, recited them in my head when I couldn't sleep. I wrote this one quickly. They were moving us again, and I didn't know if I'd get another chance. If you're reading this, I want you to promise me something. Live, please. Live with your whole heart. Love again, laugh again. Don't build a shrine to my memory. I'm not there, I'm with you. In the way you tilt your head when you're thinking, in the way you hum when you cook, in the way you make everything around you feel like home. If I didn't make it, know this. I died loving you. I died thinking your name. And if there's a next world, I'll be waiting at the edge of it until you come find me. Forever yours, Walter." Margaret didn't cry at first. She held the letter in both hands, her eyes scanning the words again and again, as if seeing them a second time might reveal a new sentence, a hidden message, another sliver of him to hold on to. Then slowly, the tears came, not violent, not loud, but deep and long and full of release. Not just for him, but for the girl she had once been, for the decades spent half alive, for the weight she'd carried without knowing just how heavy it had truly been. Franklin reached for her hand, and she let him take it. They sat like that for a long time. And when she finally looked up, she smiled, not because she wasn't sad, but because she had been seen, remembered, and loved, even across a chasm of 54 years. "I waited so long," she said. "And he found his way back," Franklin replied. "It wasn't a resurrection. It wasn't magic. It was something more powerful. It was closure." In the days that followed, Franklin continued to visit, not out of obligation or pity, but because something sacred had passed between them, something neither of them could put into words, but both felt the moment they sat across from one another and shared the silence that no longer felt heavy. There was no pretense between them, no awkwardness, no forced conversation. Only the quiet understanding that some wounds never truly close, but they can soften, They can stop bleeding, and sometimes they can even become something like peace. Margaret, for the first time in decades, felt as though her days had purpose beyond routine. She still made her morning tea, still swept the porch steps, still clipped recipes from the Asheville Citizen-Times, but now there was anticipation again. Not for some grand romantic twist or second youth, but for the simple company of someone who understood the language of grief, who didn't flinch at silence, and who had carried her name, even if just by association, for half a century. They fell into rhythm without effort. He'd stop by in the mornings with fresh bread from the corner bakery, or sometimes nothing at all except his presence. She'd make coffee, and they'd sit by the window where the light always seemed to fall just right, and speak about everything and nothing, their childhoods, old movies, the strange quiet of small towns in summer. He told her about his late wife, Eleanor, about her laugh, and how it had faded from his memory after she died, and how he hated that, because forgetting someone's voice felt like a second death. Margaret didn't try to comfort him. She didn't have to. She just listened. And when she spoke of Walter now, it wasn't in whispers or unfinished sentences. It was with fullness, with color, with the kind of grace that comes from finally having the missing piece of the puzzle, even if it arrived far too late for the life they'd planned together. She would read parts of the letter aloud again sometimes, not because she'd forgotten, but because hearing the words restored something in her. Because each time she read, "I died thinking your name," it stitched her back together a little more. They began small traditions. Friday afternoons became story time. Margaret would pull out old journals, or Franklin would bring newspaper clippings from the war years, and they'd read aloud, laugh at the absurd headlines, and trace their lives through the chaos of history like two survivors comparing maps. Sunday mornings, they walked slowly through Riverside Cemetery, not to visit anyone in particular, but to let their steps echo through the quiet, to move their bodies through a space where memory lived, but not in a haunting way, in a grounding way. Once, as they stood under the dogwoods, Margaret said, "I think Walter would have liked you." And Franklin, without turning, replied, "I hope so." I've carried his last words longer than I've carried my own regrets, because that was the truth of it. For Franklin, delivering that letter had been more than fulfilling a promise. It had been a reckoning. For decades, he had wondered why he had made it home, why he had survived when others, better men perhaps, had not. Why he had walked off the battlefield with someone else's dying breath in his hand and then failed, for years, to deliver it. He had carried that guilt like a stone in his chest, and though life went on, marriages, children, promotions, retirement, a part of him always lived in that muddy field in France, where Walter Collins had said his wife's name like a prayer and handed him something far more precious than paper. And now, watching Margaret move through her days with renewed lightness, Franklin felt something lift inside him. Not a loud release, not a tearful catharsis, but a quiet realignment. He had kept the promise. He had brought Walter home. For Margaret, there was a different kind of healing. Her life hadn't been empty. She had known moments of joy, of pride, of friendship, but it had always felt paused, like she was walking in place while the world moved on around her. Now, she wasn't waiting anymore. She was remembering. She was living. She was waking up each day knowing she'd been loved until the very end, and that someone had crossed a lifetime to return that truth to her. One afternoon, Franklin found her sitting by the mantel, the framed letter resting beside a simple gold band on a lace doily. "I wore the copper one for years," she said without looking at him. "But I figured he kept his promise. He gave me gold in the end." Franklin smiled. That night, as they sat on the porch, sipping sweet tea as the sky turned lavender, Margaret turned to him and asked, "Do you believe in timing? Like, maybe some things don't happen when we want, but when we need?" He nodded. "I think sometimes love shows up late," he said, "but it still shows up. And in the stillness that followed, with cicadas humming and the scent of pine drifting in the air, neither of them spoke again, because they didn't have to. They were already understood. Autumn came gently to Asheville that year. The trees blazed in amber and crimson. The air turned crisp with the kind of clarity that made everything seem sharper, quieter, more honest. The wind carried the scent of chimney smoke and fallen leaves, and the mountains, cloaked in gold, stood watch over the town like old sentinels. It was in this season of reflection and letting go that Margaret Collins found, at long last, the peace she hadn't even known she was still searching for. Life didn't change in any grand or dramatic way. The routines stayed. The morning tea, the crossword puzzles, the slow walks to the corner market. But there was something new beneath the surface now. A calm, a stillness that wasn't silence, but acceptance, a knowing. The framed letter, Walter's letter, remained on the mantel beside the copper ring and the photograph that had aged with her, but they were no longer symbols of absence. They had become reminders of something sacred that had been returned to her. Franklin continued to visit. They shared warm dinners, laughed over old memories that didn't belong only to them, and allowed the days to come and go without fear of what they lacked. Sometimes, Margaret would fall asleep in her armchair with the letter open in her lap, and Franklin would cover her with a blanket and sit quietly until she woke. Sometimes he'd bring his harmonica and play soft tunes on the porch while she hummed along, their music drifting down the quiet street like a lullaby for the past. One morning in late October, Franklin didn't show up. It wasn't unusual. He'd been having more trouble getting around, but by sunset, Margaret knew. And when the call came the next day from his daughter, confirming that he had passed peacefully in his sleep, Margaret stood at her kitchen window and let the tears fall, not of heartbreak, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the letter, for the promise, for the man who had carried it across time and found his way not only to her door, but into her life. At Franklin's small memorial service, Margaret stood at the back, clutching the program in both hands. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, a week later, she walked down to the riverbank where the dogwoods grew and tucked a copy of Walter's letter between the branches of a tree they'd often sat beneath together. A quiet offering, a goodbye, not to grief, but to loneliness. The years moved forward, as they always do, but Margaret never again felt lost in time, because when you are truly seen, when someone carries your name and your memory through the hardest parts of their life, only to return it to you with reverence, something changes. The wound may remain, but it no longer bleeds. She lived the rest of her days quietly, peacefully, never remarrying, never needing to us, because her heart had been full, finally, completely, and honestly. And when the day came for her own goodbye, neighbors found the letter and the ring still resting on the mantel just as she had left them, along with a note that read simply, "He came home, and so did I. Do." If this story touched you as deeply as it touched us, leave a comment and share it with someone who believes in love that endures. We post new stories every day, real stories that move and inspire.